Hey, folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University here to help you pass your NASM exam on the first attempt or second, wherever you're at in the testing process. Today, we're going to sort of continue in chapter 9, which is the nutrition chapter, and we're going to talk about carbohydrates and kind of go over a couple of things here. First and foremost, what you're probably going to need to know from a testing perspective. Again, chapter 9, as well as chapter 10 on supplementation, these chapters are not highly represented on any of the NASM exams that you're going to take. Will you find questions from them? Yeah, more than likely, maybe one, perhaps two, even up to, I think some students have said they saw multiple questions on their exam. So for sure, you'll probably see something from the nutrition chapter, and that's all well and good. But I will say this, that this is really important information just to know in general. And keep in mind that from a sort of efficiency perspective, you can pretty much go through the studying process of chapter 9, at least in this area, fairly quick. So let me go ahead and pull up the digital copy of the book for you. Give me 1 second. There we go. And here we are, chapter 9, nutrition. Again, not highly represented on the exam, but really important information. Nevertheless, we basically went from the lesson 1. If you're taking this online, by the way, and you're doing the course itself, lesson 1 just gives you information on scope of practice, and then of course it talks about proteins. And then there's carbohydrates, and then the next will be the third macronutrient, fats. And so the idea here, as with any of the chapters here in the 7th edition, they're going to give you these sidebar definitions. And again, it's highly recommended that you do what I would say is let me open this up a little bit for you, the read, write, recite method that I use, which is just I look at the word and I copy it, write down the definition. Now, I will say this, that, again, one of the tips that I will normally tell students is try and do as much in your own words, as long as it's, a valid definition. You don't want to write your own definition that does not correspond with what they're writing, but you can compress, is what I'm trying to say. You can compress their definitions into an easier way for you to understand it. I'll give you an example. So carbohydrates, compounds composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules that include simple sugars, complex carbs, glycogen, and fiber. You can perhaps get rid of a couple of those words and compress it down to like a bullet point. Carbohydrates are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, include simple sugars, complex carbs, glycogen, and fiber. So I can get rid of maybe 3 or 4 words. Anything to increase efficiency, you're going to want to do. So simple sugars, mono, disaccharides, easily absorbed. I don't know if you need to say easily absorbed into the bloodstream when you're rewriting it, but you understand I'm looking for any little bit of efficiency in my reading and rewriting strategy that I use. So again, just keep in mind, they highlight those. See this? They highlight the word. So there's your carbohydrate. And this is one of the easy things about using their digital format. So carbohydrates, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. And they can ask you questions on pretty much any of this. But if you do get questions related to the carbohydrate section in chapter 9, it's probably going to be related to some of these tables. So 9.7, the 3 monosaccharides. If they were going to ask you a question, which of the following are monosaccharides, and they would give you a list of disaccharides or polysaccharides plus one of these 3, glucose, fructose, or galactose. Remember also the other side of this, which is that you actually would like to know some of this material because it's really very important when it comes to dealing with your future clients or the clients that you're dealing with right now. So structure of carbohydrates, simple sugars or monosaccharides, glucose, obviously that's blood sugar. Fructose is what we find in Table sugar, one of the interesting things, kind of keep in mind, just as a side note, fructose is generally stopped by the liver for processing versus glucose and galactose, which readily pass through the hepatic portal, through the liver directly, glucose at least directly into the blood system. Fructose, when it's consumed, as with just about everything you consume other than alcohol, goes into the small intestines, into the hepatic portal, or what we call the portal vein, goes through the liver. Basically, the liver gets the first shot at everything that you've eaten. Everything that gets digested through the small intestines goes into the liver. Fructose stops in the liver for more additional processing, which can actually cause problems, tends to elevate triglyceride levels in the blood. But there's that page. Next page, table 9.8 gives you a list of the disaccharides. So kind of think about this. Table 9.7, 9.8, and 9.9 are basically showing you greater complexity of carbohydrates. Monosaccharides, disaccharides are generally two monosaccharides. And look, I'm not asking you to remember this. It's not necessary. This is actually just interesting information. Again, if they were to ask you a question on table 9.7 or 9.8 or 9.9, it would be simply to know that lactose and sucrose, for instance, and maltose are disaccharides, not monosaccharides, just as a for instance. One of the interesting things here, of course, is that we have what's known as high fructose corn syrup, and these are things that in the real world you want to stay away from as much as possible. Polysaccharides are longer chains of glucose units, right? These are your memorization points right here. Once again, you read it, you rewrite it, and the more you rewrite it over and over consistently, day after day, if you just even if you did that 2, 3, 4 times, and then a couple of days later you backtracked on some of the information from chapter 9 as you're redoing it, you do it again. Guarantee you will memorize this information. Of course, there's glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose. We find it in both the liver and muscle cells. There's not a whole lot of glycogen storage capability in the liver, and that glycogen storage is generally going to be utilized for maintenance of blood glucose levels. Glycogen in muscles is generally used by the muscles itself. You're not going to find muscle glycogen being pulled to supply blood glucose. Just as a for instance, there's generally more than enough glycogen in the liver to be used for maintenance of blood glucose levels. So blood sugar levels, basically. Polysaccharides are your starches. Glycogen, of course, right? And these are, and again, remember, when we're talking about carbohydrates, for the most part, this is just glucose molecules. And I mean, there are the other monosaccharides, of course, but for the most part, what we talk about is glucose, and bigger chains of glucose create these larger and larger structures known as polysaccharides. And then these are the three main type of polysaccharides that we have. Of course, the unique thing about fiber as a polysaccharide is that it has doesn't have any new nutritional value per se from a caloric standpoint. Humans, we don't use fiber as a source of ATP generation. Just so you know that. The key to fiber is that there's two types: soluble, insoluble. They have different functions in the digestive system. Soluble fibers get fermented. They create ultimately short chain fatty acids by the bacteriums and yeast, believe it or not, that live in your intestines, what we call your microbiome. Okay, that's all really interesting, important stuff. The other fiber, insoluble fiber, which does not absorb water and is not soluble in water, becomes what we call roughage. It's important for effective maintenance of peristalsis through the large intestines, or what we call the colon. So there you go when it comes to that information. Of course, now and that's what I was just talking about, soluble and insoluble fiber. Good idea to know these from a testing perspective. If they were going to ask you questions, they would just ask you they would give you a description or a quality or a health benefit. The following health benefits come from what sources, right? So, or this type of this nutrient provides or promotes health of the gastrointestinal tract by promoting healthy gut flora. So that's what they would ask you, and you would have to know that is soluble fiber. Just as for instance, adipose tissue, again, what I'm doing is I'm showing you what you would be doing when you're going through this chapter. Now, look, I'm doing this video and it's going to take maybe 15 minutes to go through it. So for the most part, just this area of chapter 9 would probably take you, anywhere between 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes to go through it. Excuse me, read, rewrite it, say it out loud. So again, I'm not saying to memorize this information. I would hope that as a trainer, to be honest with you, this stuff would start to become normative in your knowledge base and what you talk to your clients about, because nutrition in the real world of personal training, remember, ladies and gentlemen, it is the key. It is the single most important component that trainers have at their disposal, not exercise. It's not. Exercise is critically important, but nutrition is the way you're going to change people's lives, their energy levels, and their body fat levels for the most part, and muscle mass. So I would just say that, yeah, from a studying perspective for the test, it's not necessary to memorize it, but it is a good idea to understand soluble fiber versus insoluble fiber over here on the health benefits, carbohydrate digestion, absorption, utilization. Okay. Again, and they're just giving you some basic information. Too many carbs in your diet, like anything else, but carbohydrates for sure, it's going to be stored generally as fat. Once your glycogen stores are full in the muscle, full in your liver, what's the body going to do with excess or excessive carbohydrates that you're eating? Body fat, right? So that's just, you all know that. And just like with the protein component, here is the carbohydrate digestion and absorption element. Digestion of carbohydrates begins in the mouth. Salivary amylase, and a couple of enzymes in your saliva that begin the breakdown process. By the way, what that process of starting to break down of carbohydrates in the mouth continues in the stomach. So salivary amylase will continue to break down large starches, amylose and amylopectin, which are your two main starches. And that will continue in the stomach. And then ultimately in the small intestines, you're going to see the ultimate sort of the final breakdown of large starches into ultimately glucose or whatever other monodisaccharides you have consumed. But ultimately, the small intestines is going to allow for the movement of these smaller saccharides, polysaccharides, disaccharides into again, what's known as the hepatic portal. NASM just basically focuses on the portal vein, and that's going to take it to the liver. The liver does what it does. It's the main filtering organ in your body. So the portal vein, liver circulation, and that's what happens with carbohydrates. Folks, carbohydrates are not bad, okay? Just like anything else, highly processed carbohydrates with little to no fiber left in them, they can have an effect, a very, very deleterious effect on blood sugar level regulation, or what we know as what's called glycemic control. But again, that's kind of outside the scope of what we're dealing with in this particular section. Glycemic index. Now I'm going to toggle back and forth. Glycemic index and glycemic load are actually really important concepts, because a glycemic index is just a way of measuring how fast a particular carbohydrate food goes from ingestion and conversion ultimately into glucose. So it simply tells you that a specific food item that contains carbohydrates, if you eat that food item, how long does it take from the point of ingestion, goes through the stomach, small intestines, portal vein, through the liver, boom, into the general circulation? How long did that take? Did it take 2 minutes? Did it take 10 minutes? Did it take an hour? Right? That speed at which that happens tells us something about that carbohydrate containing food. And the glycemic index is simply a way of comparing a particular food to glucose itself. So in other words, all I got to do is consume a liquid glucose drink, and I put on the timer. And the amount of time it takes from that pure glucose drink to go from my mouth, click timer, ding, 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 to go in, to ultimately be registered as an increase in blood glucose in my bloodstream. How long does that take? Well, now I can compare other foods to that speed. And generally, it's going to take longer than the consumption of pure glucose. And that's what the glycemic index does. You can literally take your phone and go to Google or whatever and put in the name of a food. You can do that now. Put me on pause and put a food in your phone on Google and put the food apple glycemic index, and it will come up with the most recent research studies done on the glycemic index of an apple. You can do it with pretty much any food, and that's glycemic index. Glycemic load basically tells us the concentration of the carbohydrate in a certain volume of that food. And so glycemic index tells you how fast a particular food converts into glucose. Glycemic load tells you the total concentration. A great example of this is to look at, say, a watermelon. Okay, think of a watermelon, big old watermelon. There's not a whole lot of anything in a watermelon except water. Now, the sugars in watermelon are high glycemic index sugars, right? It's glucose, some fructose. And so it will convert quickly into glucose in your blood system. So it's high on a glycemic index. But honestly, how much of that sugar is in one watermelon? So you take a small piece of watermelon, there's not a whole lot of anything. So it's relatively low on the glycemic load category. Why? Because high glycemic index, like most sugars are, other than fructose, but there's not a lot of it. So it's not a very densely packed sugar food. I hope that makes sense. Versus, you like bagels? I love bagels. Bagels are a very concentrated source of starches. For instance, any highly processed breads, any highly processed food products generally are going to be high on a glycemic load because there's a lot of carbohydrate packed into a bagel, just as a for instance. So dietary carbohydrate needs, this is again one of those issues. I mean, table 912 is kind of a important table from a real world perspective, but folks, I'll be honest with you. You can memorize the chart. I would just memorize the numbers, get an idea of what NASM, is telling you. They're pulling this, by the way, they're pulling this information from these two sources. Look, let's take a jump into the real world while you're studying for this. No, this is just not something that is a hard and fast rule. The general understanding is that the majority of a person's calories, the majority of them should come from complex carbohydrates, i.e., whole carbohydrate type foods that have fiber in them. The problem is not necessarily the total amount, although that could be an issue. The real issue is the quality of the carbohydrate. And we're going to tell people, look, whole foods, quality foods that have not been processed, that contain fiber. I generally recommend, you can write this down for your own knowledge, generally anywhere between 40%, 30%, sometimes depending on their total body fat percentage, total percent of calories should come from complex carbs. But again, recommended carbohydrates, 3 to 5 grams of per kilogram of body weight. The reason they're giving you these numbers is because they got to give you something objective, just so you understand. So Down here, again, good information. You'll notice what I'm doing is I'm kind of helping you to move through the material in this section and keep it under about 30 minutes to 45 minutes of study time for this particular area, the carbohydrates. But again, read through it. It's interesting information. And for the most part, if you're going to try to memorize some of this, I would do it from light exercise. I would just simply try to do table 912 and rewrite it. Now, if it's me, I find this stuff very interesting. So I'm going to actually try to rewrite the table and try and memorize the table, but it's not critically necessary. Here's something you do have to keep in mind. NASM wants to make sure they cover their bases, and they want to make sure you don't do anything outside your quote scope of practice. So that's why they're giving you this critical box right here. Unless registered or licensed as a nutrition professional outside scope of practice for a fitness professional to prescribe specific meal plans for clients or athletes. No. For NASM, you passing their exam? Yes. Real world, folks, you got to help people with nutrition. Every state in the union is different with this issue. If you live in California, you can write whatever you want. You really can. They don't care. The state of California does not care. If you're in the state of Georgia, they do care. So you got to be really careful how you manage this. The point is that from a testing perspective, simply follow what they're telling you to do. They're being very conservative, very safe with this in the real world, because I want to make sure that you also understand that as a trainer, you got to be a coach, and you got to coach them in their nutrition. That's why NASM has a nutrition coach course after you get your CPT. Just keep that in mind, and they're going to give you more information on this. So ultimately, and by the way, if you're doing this, here's your little quiz to do after you get through that section. Keep in mind, the goal when I do these type of videos, is to help you pass the test. But look, there's also this other side of it. And students ask me all the time, well, I do actually want to know the information to help my clients. And I agreed. So there's that part of it as well. When you're taking the test, you may see a couple of questions from the nutrition chapter itself. Once you're done and you've passed the NASM exam, then you better get on top of the nutrition part of it, because it's the most critical element when it comes to helping people change the way their body looks and the way they feel. As always, please subscribe to our channel, share the video for those people that are interested in it, and of course, hit the notification bell so that you know when the new information is coming out. As always, we're here to help you pass the exam. That's the goal. Leave your comments below if you need more information on this particular topic. If you want information on something else related to this topic, let us know by putting the comments below. As always, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.